The Vikings had funeral rituals so disturbing that when a Muslim traveler witnessed one in 922 AD, he was traumatized for life.
Come on then, this is my marriage night.
What Ahmad Ibn Fadlan saw was a slave woman forced into group sex before being murdered, all as part of a sacred ceremony. But this was just one of several sexual practices the Vikings used as weapons of control. Funeral rites. Vikings forced slave women to have sex with multiple men before killing them at funerals, a ritual they considered sacred rather than cruel. The Muslim traveler Ahmad Ibn Fadlan described witnessing such a ceremony along the Volga River, leaving him horrified. When a chieftain died, one of his slave girls was chosen to accompany him into the afterlife. She had no choice. She was taken as an offering, treated as property, and forced to perform a ritual she could not refuse. The ceremony began with alcohol to subdue her fear and numb her body. She was lifted onto shields and paraded before the men, not as a participant, but as an object marked for sacrifice. In a nearby tent, multiple men forced themselves upon her, each act framed as part of preparing her for the world beyond. For the Vikings, this was an essential spiritual duty, a demonstration of loyalty to the dead chieftain. For the girl, it was terror and helplessness, every moment layered with fear, confusion, and humiliation. She was surrounded, powerless, her body turned into a symbol of devotion she never chose. Once the acts were complete, her life was ended. She was laid beside the chieftain, and both were placed on a pyre, set ablaze in a ceremony meant to send them together into the afterlife. Ibn Fadlan's writings, along with archaeological evidence like the Oseberg ship burial, confirm that such human sacrifices were real, not myth. The ritual combined sex, violence, and death in a way outsiders could barely comprehend. Yet, to the Vikings, it was sacred, a necessary passage. These funerals reveal a society where intimacy was weaponized, obedience was demanded, and terror was sanctified, turning the final moments of a woman's life into both worship and horror. Same-sex relations. Vikings were so terrified of being called gay that their laws made it legal to murder anyone who suggested it. In Iceland's law code, an insult like arger or sordin, words that branded a man as passive in sex, was treated as a killer word. If spoken aloud, the accused man had the right to strike back and even kill the insulter without facing punishment. For the Norse, masculinity was life or death, and to be seen as weak or submissive could destroy a man's place in society. This fear created a culture of paranoia. A single word could strip a man of his honor, his right to land, his weapons, and even his voice in court. The sagas are full of feuds that began with such insults. In Egil's saga, accusations of unmanliness led to duels and revenge killings. In Gisli's saga, taunts about weakness escalated into bloodshed that pulled entire families into conflict. A careless insult could unleash violence that lasted for generations. Even the gods were not safe from this kind of ridicule. Odin was mocked for practicing cedar, a form of magic linked to women, while Loki was ridiculed for taking on female shapes and even giving birth. If the gods themselves could be shamed, mortal men had even more reason to guard their reputations fiercely. What mattered most was dominance. Same-sex intimacy was not forbidden as long as a man stayed the active partner. But the terror of being seen as passive meant Viking men constantly had to prove themselves through aggression, strength, and domination. Their laws and their sagas show a society where masculinity was fragile, reputation was everything, and one dangerous word could turn into blood. Slave breeding and sexual economy in Viking society. 1 in 3 people in Viking Dublin were slaves, many born from systematic breeding programs. This was not random brutality, but an organized machine of human exploitation. Viking raids did not only take gold and goods, they took women, forcing them into camps where their children would be born as the next generation of slaves. This industrial-scale system shaped entire cities. In Dublin alone, nearly a third of the population lived in bondage, and much of it was rooted in the trauma of these programs. Travelers who saw it firsthand were horrified. The Arab writer Ibn Fadlan described Viking men as filthy, like donkeys, with no sense of honor, recounting how women were treated as objects, passed between men, and forced into submission. Such testimony shocked outsiders but matched what the sagas themselves reveal. These weren't just stories of battles, they also told of shame, honor killings, and violent retaliation when women resisted. In some tales, a woman who dishonored her family could be killed by her own kin, a stark reminder of how paranoia over reputation fueled violence. This was not just war. It was a society built on fear. Marriages could be tested in public to prove fertility and dominance. Failures led to ridicule, challenges, and even bloodshed. And for enslaved women, there was no escape. Their bodies were used to secure profit and power, their children locked into chains from birth. The scars of this system ran deep. Communities carried the weight of generational trauma, where the line between family, slave, and enemy blurred. Behind the legend of fierce Viking warriors lies this darker truth: an empire where intimacy was twisted into a weapon, and entire populations lived under the shadow of violence and control. Public wedding rituals. Vikings didn't trust newlyweds to consummate their marriage privately, so they sent 6 witnesses to make sure it happened. On the wedding night, by torchlight, the bride and groom were escorted to their chamber, while a small crowd looked on. The witnesses didn't stay to watch the act itself, but their presence was enough to turn the most private moment of life into a public performance. Without this validation, a marriage could later be challenged or annulled, leaving both families shamed. Few societies in history ever demanded proof of a couple's wedding night, but the Vikings treated it as law. Where most cultures allowed the bedroom to remain private, the Norse dragged it into the open. The groom entered knowing that failure could mean humiliation, repayment of the dowry, or even lifelong whispers of weakness. For the bride, too, the ritual carried heavy weight. Her reputation, her family's honor, and future alliances depended on being publicly seen as a true wife. The wedding itself was steeped in sacred symbolism. A goat or boar might be sacrificed for fertility, and sometimes Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, was placed in the bride's lap to invoke divine blessing. Yet even these rituals of blood and gods led to the same final test: the torchlit walk to the bed, overseen by witnesses who would later swear the marriage was real. Refusing witnesses was unthinkable. Any couple who tried to bar them risked having their marriage declared invalid, undoing all the feasts, sacrifices, and agreements that had brought the families together. The ritual reveals just how far Viking society went to control and verify sexual duty. Even amid sacred celebration, intimacy was not left to trust. It was made a matter of record, as unusual then as it is unsettling now. Berserker sexual rituals. Berserkers, the legendary Viking warriors known for their terrifying rage in battle, were sometimes just as dangerous off the battlefield, and some sagas suggest they acted violently in sexual ways too. In the Gisla saga, a berserker named Skeggi is described as aggressively going after a woman who was already with another man, showing that their lack of control could reach beyond fighting into relationships and personal matters. Berserkers entered a trance-like state called Berserkergang, where they lost control of themselves, felt no pain, and acted with extreme force. While this helped them defeat enemies in battle, It sometimes led to sexual harassment or violence because they ignored normal social rules. Historical texts like Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum describe berserkers taking what they wanted without asking, frightening communities during raids. These actions were not always praised. Many sagas show berserkers' behavior as disruptive, highlighting the conflict between their power as warriors and the harm they caused. Archaeological finds, including rune stones and carvings, suggest that berserkers were linked to both violence and ritualized behavior, although the sexual parts are less clear and sometimes symbolic. These stories reveal a Viking society where men with great fighting skills could sometimes break social rules, but their actions were also recorded as warnings. Understanding berserker conduct helps us see the darker side of Viking life, where men celebrated for courage and strength could also act with uncontrolled aggression and sexual domination. Exposure and infanticide. Linked to gender. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking families ended the lives of baby girls at nearly twice the rate of boys, a chilling sign of how deeply gender shaped survival in their world. This was not random desperation, but a cold calculation. Families struggling with limited food, land, and resources often decided which child would live and which would not, weighing the cost of raising another mouth against the potential value that child might bring. Boys were seen as future workers, warriors, and heirs to the family name. Girls, by contrast, could require costly dowries and were sometimes viewed as an economic burden, especially if a household already had daughters. The method was often exposure, newborns left outside, abandoned in the cold, or placed where no rescue was likely. Some sagas even describe babies left on hillsides or at crossroads, their survival left to fate or to passing strangers who rarely intervened. While this practice may sound unthinkable today, evidence from burial sites and written sources confirms it was not uncommon in Viking society. The decision was not only practical, but cultural, reinforcing a hierarchy in which men carried power and women's roles were sharply limited. For mothers, the impact could be devastating. A woman might have carried and delivered her child only to see the father or family elders decide that the baby would not be raised. Grief and helplessness marked these moments, but the collective logic of survival and honor often overrode individual feelings. This was more than personal tragedy. It was systematic. By controlling reproduction in this way, Viking families ensured that gender inequality began at birth. The choice to favor boys shaped communities, altered demographics, and set the stage for the strict roles that men and women would occupy throughout their lives. What may look like desperate acts of survival were, in reality, acts of cultural design. The deliberate molding of society through life and death decisions at the very first moments of existence. Groom's intimate performance. Viking marriages could be annulled if witnesses testified that the husband couldn't perform sexually. What should have been the most private part of a marriage was dragged into the open, turning the bedroom into a stage for humiliation. If a groom failed to consummate the union, the bride's family had the right to challenge the marriage, demand a divorce, and even reclaim or increase the dowry as punishment for dishonoring the contract. In some cases, men not only lost their wives, but also their wealth, reputation, and political alliances. The most humiliating part was how public the failure became. In extreme situations, neighbors or household servants could be called to testify about whether the marriage had been completed. Imagine the shame of having your intimate life debated at the Law Rock in front of your community. A single accusation could stain a man's honor for life, and whispers of his failure could follow his family for generations. Old sagas reveal how high the stakes were. In Njal's saga, Hrútur Herjolfsson married Unnr, but, cursed by a queen, he could not consummate the marriage. Unnr, frustrated and dishonored, carried out the divorce ritual in 3 dramatic stages. First in their bed, then at the doorway, and finally at the public law rock. Each declaration stripped Hrútur of dignity, and with the crowd as witness, the marriage was undone. She left not only free, but also with her property restored. This case shows how deeply Viking society tied sex to power and status. A groom's failure in bed wasn't just a personal matter. It could dissolve alliances, bring public disgrace, and shift the balance between families who depended on the union for wealth and influence. Incest and cousin marriage. In the Viking Age, marriage was not just about love. It was a powerful tool for controlling land, wealth, and alliances. What set the Vikings apart from many of their neighbors was how far they were willing to go with kin marriages. While cousin marriages happened elsewhere in Europe, Viking records and archaeology suggest they pushed this practice to extremes. In sagas like Laxdæla saga, family unions between close kin are presented almost matter-of-factly, showing how normal it was for elite clans to marry within their bloodline to lock in power. The Icelandic law code Gragas allowed unions that today would be considered far too close, only drawing the line at siblings. Recent DNA studies from Viking burials add scientific weight to these stories. In some graves, couples have been found to be as closely related as half-siblings or uncle and niece, relationships that would have been scandalous in other medieval societies. These findings reveal that kin marriages weren't rare exceptions, but part of a larger pattern of keeping resources inside the family. The consequences, however, were not always hidden. Modern geneticists point out that repeated close kin unions can increase the risk of inherited disorders, and skeletal remains sometimes show deformities or health problems that may link back to inbreeding. This makes the Viking strategy of marriage both a source of strength and a hidden weakness. Christianity's spread in the 10th and 11th centuries eventually clashed with these traditions. The Church condemned close kin marriages as sinful, forcing Scandinavian elites to abandon practices that had once seemed normal. But before that shift, Viking society embraced marriages that shocked outsiders, and their sagas, laws, and even DNA show just how far they went to bind blood and power together. Women's paradoxical rights in Viking society. In Viking society, the lives of women revealed a brutal divide, one that exposed the darkest side of power. While a handful of free women could own land, manage farms, and even leave their husbands, this freedom only existed because others lived in chains. Enslaved women were the ones who paid the true price of Viking power, and their treatment was nothing short of systematic exploitation. These women were not seen as people but as property. They had no right to refuse, no control over their own bodies, and no escape from the demands of their masters. Travelers who witnessed Viking culture, like the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, described scenes where enslaved women were forced to serve both at feasts and in beds, with their suffering treated as ordinary. Viking sagas and laws may mention the rights of free wives, but between the lines lies the silence of countless women whose voices were stolen. The contrast was striking. While a wealthy woman like Un the Deep-Minded could walk away from her marriage and command respect, enslaved women were trapped in a cycle of forced intimacy and breeding. Their children were born into bondage, creating new generations of slaves. In places like Dublin, 1 in 3 people lived as slaves, many descended from women who had no choice in their fate. This was not random cruelty. it was a system. Viking power thrived on breaking women down, using them as tools for both labor and reproduction. The paradox of Viking society wasn't progress, but the chilling reality that freedom for some was built on the exploitation of others. Behind the heroic myths, this hidden story of domination reveals a culture where forbidden practices were not exceptions, but the foundation of daily life. Sexual display in festivals. In the Viking Age, festivals were not just feasts. They were occasions when society's normal rules loosened, and forbidden acts became part of sacred celebration. One of the most shocking aspects to outsiders was the open sexual activity that occurred.
And we have a lot of mythology built up around them and what they did, and we're here to show.
Men and women sometimes formed temporary unions during these gatherings, partnerships that could last only for the festival, but were recognized socially and spiritually. These acts were not seen as shameful. Instead, they honored the gods of fertility, Freyr and Freya, and were believed to ensure strong families, good harvests, and the continuation of life. Christian observers and Muslim travelers like Ahmad Ibn Fadlan were horrified. He described people openly displaying desire, with flirting, touching, and acts of intimacy in public, sometimes in ways that shocked even the most worldly foreigners. Monks traveling in Viking lands noted drunken revelries. Boundaries seemed non-existent. Some festivals even included temporary marriages arranged for the duration of the celebrations, a practice that both bound the community and reflected a sacred trust in divine fertility.
And I was thinking, if you can do an event that has something for everybody, that's the best way.
Archaeological evidence confirms these accounts. Erotic carvings, amulets depicting sexual symbols, and figurines suggest that sexuality was celebrated openly in connection with religious rituals. Certain paired burials and offerings indicate temporary unions or fertility rites tied to the cycles of festivals. These findings show that sexuality was deeply woven into Viking spiritual life, not hidden, but performed as part of communal devotion. These gatherings combined drinking, music, dancing, and sexual acts into a single intense communal event. The sexual displays were not only tolerated, but sacred, expressions of vitality and closeness to the divine. Outsiders often saw them as chaotic or sinful, yet for the Vikings, they were meaningful rituals that strengthened bonds, honored deities, and reinforced social cohesion. Festivals reveal how Viking culture blurred the line between the forbidden and the sacred, making these gatherings moments of communal joy, religious devotion, and moral shock for visitors. We hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for more amazing stories.